Welcome to Practical Parapsychology. Join your PhD host Drs. Brian Laythe and Cindy Little as they arm you with the latest scientific research and know-how on ghostly phenomena. Brian is the lead author of the groundbreaking new book, Ghosted, Exploring the Haunting Reality of Paranormal Encounters, and Cindy is the proprietor of WacoGhost.com, a portal for professional investigations and public education on ghostly phenomena. Together, with their recurring guest, parapsychologist Dr. James Houran, they will take important steps with you to gain scientific answers about the nature of the paranormal experiences and the people who have them. For more information on practical parapsychology, visit their website at www.practicalparapsychology.com. Practical Parapsychology. The class is now in session.
Oh, I'm deaf. It's one of those days. It's going to be a rough Friday. Well, Jim's on the show again, so I'm blaming Jim. So that's how we're.
Yes, it's my psychokinetic abilities that are just screwing with your presentation ability.
Well, welcome to Friday. Okay,
yeah.
Hey everybody.
Or it's just Friday.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new Monday, by the way. Friday's the new Monday.
Feels like it some days. Welcome to Practical Parapsychology, everybody. I'm Brian and Cindy, and if you're true believers, if you're getting that tingle up your neck and the hairs raising, that's because we have our skeptic, Dr. James Houran, back with us today. And we are going to be doing a little bit of a creepypasta mixed with some survey of strange events analysis today, right? So today we're going to be reading some both haunting accounts, but we're also going to delve into the weird, spooky world of imaginary friends. And we're going to show how the survey of strange events can help you isolate the individual phenomena that is actually contained within people's ghost stories and imaginary friends accounts. So, this is kind of a practical show in the sense we're going to show you how to use the SSE in the sense of isolating those events and seeing what the core phenomena that would be deemed, haunting or paranormal would be. And hopefully we'll be able to show some context in some of the accounts that we read. Although I'm counting on Cindy to use some like really crazy voices when she's reading accounts.
Yeah, don't hold your breath.
I was practicing on the Scottish accent. I'll be honest. I'm not going to do it because it'll be bad.
Oh, come on.
But yeah. Well,
Science takes another giant leap off a cliff.
Yeah, well,
let's not bring caricatures and cartoons into this.
Well, I do have a PhD in Scottish accents. I mean, come on.
And no one will ever take that away from you.
Yeah, I know. It's mine. It's all mine. But no, the point of this today, guys, is, and maybe you guys have 2 cents on it, is that, we've said several times that haunting events are kind of a tangled ball of yarn when you start looking at narratives in particular. So, part of this, whether you ever want to really use the SSE or not, is, I think there's going to be value in this episode for lay people and ghost hunters in the sense of, being able to separate the story that goes around the events that we would deem to be quote unquote hauntings. Do you have any 2 cents on that?
Narrative. That's the key word. It's the word of the week, narrative, because that's how human beings think.
Yeah.
We are a species that makes sense of our world and communicates that in stories. That's the, no pun intended, medium of choice, stories. And so you can't blame people when they give you an account that is full of drama in theater. It's a story that they're telling you because that's how they make sense of it. So there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. There's a narrative. However, in that narrative, you strip back the onion layers, are just the facts, ma'am, right? Just there's some core variables. And there is a technique in science called content analysis, where you actually can change verbal information, whether it's written down or spoken, into numbers. And if you have it in numbers, now you can do all sorts of interesting analysis with it, and you can detect patterns that you normally couldn't just by listening to a story. And so that's the major breakthrough that I think that we all had when we developed the Survey of Strange Events, or the SSE for short. It's a way to kind of get at the kernels of just exactly what happened to a person, or what happened to you when you were in that haunting environment without the story around it. Now, we can also do some interesting things with the story, but looking at just the key elements of what happened, we find some interesting patterns, as we'll talk about later.
Yeah. And Cindy, I think you had 2 cents and you were going to share with the listenership kind of where we got these accounts, what we mean by coding, things along those lines.
Yeah, and Jim touched on it beautifully just a second ago there. Yeah, this process is called coding. You talk about the ball of yarn. We're trying to untangle the ball of yarn. And when we can take what we call qualitative data, which is most of the time words, and convert that into quantitative or numerical data that gives us the ability to infer things about people or events or describe groups of people or events. We call it generalization. We learn things about groups of people through coding. And yes, what we do is we look through these narratives for these patterns, these bits of factual information. And that's what we use the SSE for, because it gives us the guide to go by. It gives us the instruments to use when it comes to untangling the ball of yarn and describing and inferring information about these events and about the individuals who have them. So all to say, that's what we call coding, and that's why researchers do it.
Yep.
Let me say something, because I know I'm the skeptic here, but changing words into numbers and trying to decode narratives to understand the core elements of an experience is not debunking. That's not even skeptical. You're trying to just learn and understand what is at the heart of experiences. So it shouldn't be confused over we're trying to demystify or debunk or dismiss those narratives. We're trying to understand them in a way that gets beyond the wrapping to what's underneath.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the final note to it is there is, no such thing, never such a thing as perfect coding, right? Because, we think about language being imperfect. Well, sometimes translating sentences to numbers and coding systems isn't always perfect. We may even get into some debates today about how to appropriately code some of these cases. And you need to know that's normal in science, right? We have this debate behind the scenes trying to get the best accuracy when we're trying to create formulas or trying to create tallies of numbers or codings or checklists. That's part of that, patience that PhDs develop in graduate school as we spend endless hours tallying number sheets and getting low self-esteem and feeling bad about ourselves. So, without further, you're smiling, but it's true, Jim.
I feel just fine about myself, and you should too.
Yeah, I do. I really do. So on that note, Cindy, do you want to read the first one, or do you want me to?
Oh, let's see here. I'm getting my account. I'll go ahead and read the first one. I'll let you read the second one.
Okay. Can you do a French accent?
I cannot.
Don't do a French accent, but I would be curious, as I'm sure our listeners would, is where did these come from?
These came from Reddit. We went on Reddit, and specifically, this was one of our follow-up studies that Jim is going to talk about a little bit later in the show, where we purposefully looked for cases on Reddit or stories on Reddit that described imaginary companions. We will probably refer to them as ICs occasionally as we're going through this episode. So imaginary companions that seem to have characteristics more like hauntings or something more ghostly or paranormal. And we collected I think it was over 50 cases and analyzed them.
Oh, no, it was over 100. We did over 100.
Was it?
Yes.
Maybe we narrowed it down to about that many.
At this point, it's been what, 4 years? Yeah, but anyway.
It has. It's been a little while.
Yeah.
I'll clarify that later, but go ahead.
Yeah.
And to be clear to the readership before you start, or the listenership before you start reading, we're starting with haunting cases, right? We're going to move into imaginary friends about halfway through the episode.
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and read the first case? Okay, here we go. All right. On Halloween 2 years ago, I had walked down to my mom's work in spooky makeup at around 1 to 3 p.m. There's a massive hill on the main road in my town that goes to stores and most jobs and stuff, including my mom's job. So when I went home, I had to climb up this hill. When I did, I felt unsettled and alert. I kept looking behind me, but no one was there. I then heard footsteps when I nearly reached the top, and I checked again, but I was still all alone. At the top of the hill is a crosswalk, which I waited at. I was exhausted and drank some water. Then a man came up beside me, unfazed by the heavily inclined hill, which nearly everyone in town gets tired from. He waited for the light with me, and I eventually looked over at him. He was wearing a black hoodie with his hood covering his face and black shoes and pants. I felt uncomfortable looking at him, so I kept my eyes forward, but felt like he was staring at me. When the light changed, he climbed up rocks to the side of the fence and he phased through the fence, then disappeared. I panicked, but tried to make it seem normal. He could have walked really fast. Maybe he turned a corner of the building. A few minutes later, I finally began to stop thinking about it. I kept my head down to calm myself. And when I looked up, the man was walking in front of me again. I became hysterical and called my brother to tell him what had happened as I watched the man jaywalk without looking for cars and continue down the road.
Well done.
Spooky.
Yeah.
I'd love to have that kind of experience. Yeah.
We should have gotten some background sounds for that. That'd have been a good narrative. So, but, case in point is, you get caught up in that story, and we're not too far. We've got about a minute left, but right off the top of the bat, I saw three. I saw three, actually only three phenomena that would categorize on the SSE. So I had a negative feeling for no obvious reason, like anger, sadness, panic, or danger. Item 17, I heard mysterious mechanical or nondescript noises such as tapping, knocking, rattling, banging, crashing, or quote unquote here, footsteps, right? And then I saw with my naked eye an obvious ghost or apparition, a human form that looked like a living person. Did you guys get anything different?
I did not. On this particular account, I got the same exact things. And just a note to our listeners, this is really important in the coding process. It's a very subjective process. And what we're doing is independently rating these stories. And this is what we did on our studies as well. And so this is kind of a demonstration of that. On this particular story, Brian and I coded it the exact same way, but that's not going to be the case in all of these stories, which is a good thing.
Yeah, which actually that's we're right up to our first break, and we'll talk about how cross-coding is done and analyzed when we come back from the break with Practical Parapsychology. Welcome back to Practical Parapsychology, everybody. I'm Brian, and this is Cindy. Say hi, Cindy.
Hello.
And we are with Dr. James Houran. Hi, Jim.
Hey there.
All right. So before the break, we were talking about the idea of basically having independent coders, right? So does somebody want to be mathematical and explain that briefly, or do you want me to do it? Okay, you're just staring at me.
By all means, go ahead. But then I have a comment.
Oh, okay. Jim has a comment. Of course. No, in a nutshell, guys, mathematically, when we're doing these kind of cases, you get several independent coders, and then the idea is you can look at where they agree and disagree, and get an overall calculation of how accurate the coding is, right? So it's we want to make it clear to everybody that you can't just arbitrarily code this and nobody looks. If you're doing a science paper, nobody looks at how close were the accounts aligned. And when they don't align, usually there's either a third rater or there comes to a compromise, or in some cases you throw the case out, because the idea is that you want as much agreement with rating as humanly possible. But does that sound succinct enough? No, thank you.
Very good. That was very good. But usually when you're developing questionnaires, you can even have a more fundamental problem. And that is people don't even agree on what they're reading. Forget about if they agree if something was present or not in a story. It's just that people interpret questions in different ways. We call that response bias in the world of psychometrics, the science of surveys. And actually, the SSE went through a very rigorous process where we ensure that, one, the reading comprehension was relatively low. Most people can read the sentences, the statements, what you're trying to code for. And then also we found that it doesn't matter if you're young or old, male or female, the basic demographics of the coder, the person answering the survey, does not skew the results. So it's not as if people have wildly different interpretations of, well, what does this question or this statement even mean? And that's a good bit of quality control because it helps reduce bias. So even though you certainly want to have more than one rater just to make sure that the codings are accurate, people didn't miss something that was in a story, it's important to remember that already this is a well-validated instrument that already gets ahead of the curve on controlling for bias.
No, I absolutely agree. And so to be clear, right, the validity of the items themselves, which is what you're talking about, Jim, then now there's that secondary process of how do we apply well-defined scale items to a narrative accurately, which is where the cross-coding occurs, right, where we do validity in terms of multiple people interpreting.
Yes.
So.
Exactly. Now,
Yep.
it just so happens when you're dealing with haunt stories, usually people are pretty descriptive. Okay,
Yes.
they're there. They usually don't miss a beat. If anything, you have to look through all the different adjectives, but usually it's pretty obvious, even to people that are not trained in survey research or the science of assessments, to look at a haunt narrative, look at our SSE checklist and say, oh my goodness, they're clearly referencing this kind of effect or this sign or this symptom. So just the nature of the experiences lends itself very well to some accurate coding.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I guess it's my turn to read an account, huh?
Go for it.
All right.
Scare me. I dare you.
Ooh, how was that?
That
Did it
is
work?
scary.
That was the horrible sound effect. That's just...
Just take out my false teeth. I don't have false teeth, but still. All right. So here we go. All right. Case 2, ladies and gentlemen. When I was about 15 to 17 years old, I was in a bed on my phone listening to music when I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. I thought it was my dad and freaked out because I was meant to be asleep and not on my phone. I tried to turn off the music and hide my phone under the covers, but I couldn't turn it off in time, and I heard my dad's footsteps come up to the end of my bed and stop. I pretended to be asleep, and then when my dad didn't say anything, I turned on my phone light and peeked over the covers to see if he was gone, which is always a mistake. Instead of seeing my dad at the end of the bed, I see this tall man with dark brown hair and a gray blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looks like he's been caught in the rain. He's drenched and he's staring directly above my bed. I try to call out to my dad, but I'm laying at a weird angle and I'm kind of whisper screaming at this point, and he reaches his hand out and grabs the top of my foot over the covers. I can move my toes, but I can't pull my foot away, and I'm hyperventilating now. At this point, I'm shaking. I'm so scared, I lay back and take a deep breath, and I peek over the covers, and he's gone. I turn on the light under my bed head and call my friend, super freaked out. They say maybe I had my first experience of sleep paralysis, and I suggest I try to sleep and take my mind off of it. I decide to sleep with the bed light on, but I wake up and it's off. I asked my dad if he turned it off or the power tripped, but he said no. The only way to turn off the light is to reach underneath the bed head to flick it off or turn it off and at the wall, and I don't remember turning it off. I then realized that where the guy was looking was where I had placed a dream catcher, parentheses, weird coincidence, but I had gotten it the day before, and it wasn't straight, and I hadn't felt right about it not being straight. So I fixed it, and I've never seen him again. I also started sleeping on the other side of my bed because, quote unquote, screw that, right? Initially, I thought maybe I had sleep paralysis, but I'd never had it before. I could move my body and my toes. I wasn't pinned. I thought maybe it was a dream, but I could feel his hand on my foot. My music had played continuously and didn't change at all from me taking a deep breath and him being gone. The end. Jim, are you scared?
Terrified.
Okay, there you go.
Actually, if that happened to me, I probably would be. I have actually experienced sleep paralysis, and even if you know what it is in the moment, it's terrifying. So it's horrible advice, though, to tell someone, "What? Just relax, go back to sleep." That's not usually what happens.
No,
but no, that's a very interesting story. There's a lot to it, and obviously, there's an element that maybe sounds like sleep paralysis. But again, the idea is not to try to come up with some explanation. You're not trying to dismiss it. You're trying to understand what actually happened. What are the contents, the context, and the catalyst in the story? So again, this is a great one to delve into.
And I've got some add-on for that. But first, Cindy, what did you code off of that?
Well, let's see. I coded some footsteps, which is a nondescript noise. This is from the SSE, a human-looking apparition, and mysterious, threatening touch. I mean, he grabbed her foot. That would have freaked me out. Negative feeling. She was hyperventilating. And still, for me, the jury's out on whether or not it was a sleep paralysis episode or not. But I would definitely consider that.
Well, here's where I am going to give some 2 cents, because I've spent a fair amount of time studying hypnagogic episodes. And to me, I mean, I know sometimes people will put those together. Sleep paralysis can come with hypnagogia, but to me, that seems more like a clear-cut case of a hypnagogic episode. If you wanted to go purely psychological, medical, right, since you can have full-blown auditory, tactile, and visual hallucinations when you are in a hypnagogic state, that would be my go-to skeptical response for that. Of course, probably people don't necessarily know about hypnagogic episodes. Anybody want to fill that in, or do you want me to do it?
Go for it.
Go ahead.
All right. So
Steal the show.
I am stealing this show. You guys need to do your part. There is a basically in stage 1 alpha sleep, right? And the example I used to even use in classrooms was I used to ask a question: how many of you guys, right when you were falling asleep, at that point where you knew you were about to fall asleep but you weren't quite there, heard a voice, heard a noise, or felt something odd? And normally I would get something like a third of the class raise their hand. And I would say, well, you basically entered into an early, right? Kind of that early stage where what's called a hypnagogic episode can occur. So basically this is a natural state where your brain is both kind of awake and asleep at the same time. And as a result, you can believe yourself to be fully awake, but since you are partially in a dream state, you can have full-blown auditory, visual, kinesthetic hallucinations that seem very, very real. And again, you won't be aware that you're sleeping or in like a quasi-sleep state. I've had a few of these personally when I was younger.
Very good. Now, of course, there's another time where it can occur. That was hypnagogic. There's also hypnopompic when you're coming out of sleep. Same state. One's going in, one's coming out.
Yeah.
But again, the dream states, those sleep states, very common context for all sorts of paranormal experiences, including sleep paralysis, where people can also feel such extreme reactions of terror and also a sensed presence that they start calling it old hag attacks, succubus, incubi experiences. Long tradition throughout history of these kinds of occurrences.
Oh, yeah. Although, sorry, got to be a believer for a second. Hufford does document a few cases where there are external objective paranormal phenomena in conjunction with the night hag episode. So I don't tend to lean towards a purely medical explanation when it goes with sleep paralysis and hypnagogic episodes.
Of course you don't. Now, David Hufford, okay, now first, he's still around. He's a buddy. He actually contributed a chapter to one of the first edited books I did. And it is interesting in this particular story, and I don't remember, Cindy, maybe you said this. I don't remember you saying it, though. The person, the experiencer, also talked about light being on that he didn't remember, right?
Yep.
And also a dream catcher that may have shifted its position. Now, he didn't necessarily attribute the shifted dream catcher to something paranormal, but certainly hinted that, wait a minute, I don't remember the light being on, off, whatever. It's, so that might be, if you want to call it, either an object movement or an erratic functioning of electrical equipment.
See, that's what I was thinking. As you all were talking, I was thinking about the light. She said that she, turned on the light to sleep with the light on, and then she fell asleep. When she woke up, the light was off. And from the way she described it, the light is hard to turn off. The switch was like under the bed or something. So I thought that was unusual. I mean, could she have hallucinated the light being on or off? Sure, I suppose. But that's really kind of something that gave me pause.
It does give you pause. And that's one of the, I think, the limitations of any kind of research like this, not just in parapsychology and certainly not just with ghosts or haunt phenomena. But if you are listening to someone over a podcast, over the internet, or you're reading about their account, you can only code things so far and be accurate. At some point, it gets to be speculative. And you can take that into account, actually. We have in our own research. But if you're using this in a situation of field research, that's the cue for the researcher to ask follow-up questions to clarify things like that with the experiencer to get the most accurate codings as possible. In fact, in a lot of cases, you can actually have the experiencer complete the questionnaire, and then you can have it directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But that's a good example of sometimes it does get fuzzy, but depending on the context and the opportunity, you can clarify those things that are big question marks.
Well, interesting case in point that we just did with bias and error. I read that account and I assumed it was a boy, right? Cindy said she through the entire account because we don't actually know the gender of the person that did it. I thought that was
also
interesting.
said he not know, but and who knows, maybe a phantom gender identity change happened. Maybe that was an uncoded part of the experience. And that was obviously a joke that just fell flat. So apologize for that. The look on your face is great. Like, where's Jim?
No,
I don't think sex change is actually on the SSE, nor should it be.
Well, okay, that's fair. I think that's fair. But see, I'm obsessing right now because I do know about hypnopompic episodes, but I got tired of explaining both to students, so I just stuck with hypnagogic. So I don't like the jab, sir. I really don't.
Whatever. I'm a skeptic, so
Boys.
whatever.
Play nice, guys. Play
Okay,
nice.
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's 2 accounts. And, what hopefully you can see from this is you get some fairly long stories, listeners, dear listeners. But, when you really start looking at the core phenomena that people are reacting to, right? We're looking at, 3 or 4 items, right? 3 or 4 individual phenomenological items that, could appear to be paranormal that the entire story is focused upon, right? Doesn't take much to build a ghost story in terms of phenomena, so to speak. Oh, well, I think we're actually coming close to a break again. So we will be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Practical Parapsychology, everybody. And it is about time for me to shut the heck up and let Cindy and Jim talk about how we can take imaginary friend accounts, spooky imaginary friend accounts, and apply the same items of the SSE to said accounts. And so I thought I would let either one of you kind of do an introduction to that before and you know what? I'll even volunteer to read both accounts so you all don't have to worry about it.
Just don't read them as if you're a child. We don't need regression hypnosis. We don't need we don't need more drama than there already is. Okay. But actually, this is to me one of the most fascinating studies that we've ever did and published. And there wasn't just one, there were several. I wish I could say this idea was unique to me, to us. It wasn't. I've heard many people speculate that, wait a minute, imaginary friends sometimes have characteristics that go beyond just normal imagination and get downright spooky, sometimes even terrifying, and that there might be something supernatural to some of those experiences. In fact, in the early 19th century, it usually was thought that imaginary friends or pretend friends, we call ICs for imaginary companion, were either paranormal or indicated mental illness. But that there was something clearly wrong here when children started to talk or interact with these invisible characters. And so no one, surprisingly, ever delved into that to see, hey, are some of those experiences something beyond just normal childhood development, beyond more just childhood imagination? Could there be something parapsychological? So we decided to delve into it. And because we had the SSE, that gave us a tool that we could use, because it's fascinating. When you start reading through children's accounts or the parents' accounts of what they saw or heard with their child, of some of these spooky IC experiences, oh my goodness, the actual contents of those experiences often line up really well with what you see on the SSE. But we wanted to go and look at it in a very structured, systematic, scientific way. And so we first did a study where we just looked at the general characteristics of imaginary companions. What actually is reported under what context? And we compare that to what's reported under what context with ghostly experiences. Not just any ghostly experiences, but ones that we consider spontaneous. Things that happen to people who were not looking for it. They weren't on a ghost tour. It wasn't paranormal tourism. They just suddenly had an experience under a situation that precluded placebo effects, let's say. When you look at those experiences against the major characteristics of ICs, some interesting findings emerged. First, if you look at the incidence rate, how often do both children and adults report childhood imaginary companions? Okay, and in some cases, the adults have these imaginary companion experiences even in their adulthood. So they can happen to children, but also they can happen in adulthood. When you look at the prevalence, the statistics of how often do these occur, they don't line up well with mental illness, and they don't line up to ghostly experiences that happened under, let's call them, structured contexts, like ghost tours, or when people are trying to invent an account just to get attention. They line up really well with the incident rate of spontaneously ghosted episodes. So the natural expression of haunted phenomena, ghostly phenomena, matches really well with the natural expression of imaginary companions. But you also look at the profile of the people that have these experiences. We know that children that have imaginary companions tend to be actually stronger in verbal fluency, larger imaginations, they're much more open, they're much more creative. exactly the same kinds of characteristics we see with people that routinely have ghostly experiences. In fact, both sets of experiences seem to coincide with something that we call transliminality, which has to do with how sensitive somebody is to not only what's happening in the environment, in other words, outside of them, but how sensitive they are to what's happening inside of them, physically and psychologically. So these are just ultra sensitive people. Childhood companions often have an auditory component. People are talking, they're interacting with this invisible being. Well, you see that quite commonly in ghostly episodes. It's not the first thing that people report, but it is one of the early signs or symptoms that something is happening that might be ghostly. But then childhood imaginary companions, as well as the ones that happen in adulthood, it's not just about what they hear. There's all range of sensory modalities involved in these. People sometimes say that they see something, they feel a presence or maybe being touched. So it's not just something that people hear. It involves many different senses, including a sense presence where they feel like they're just simply not alone. You see the same sets of symptoms, generally in the same order, with ghostly episodes. And where it gets really freaky is there's a difference in childhood imaginary companions. There's generally two types of experience. There's one called the shallow, which, in other words, very super imaginary friend, very superficial. The person, the character that that child is interacting with, or the adult, is basically a carbon copy of themselves. So there's not much creativity there. It's under the control of the person having the experience. They can turn it off and they can turn it on. But at a certain level, it stops being shallow and it turns into what we call a deep IC. Deep meaning, oh my goodness, this character, this imaginary companion seems to have a personality of its own and a will of its own. And in fact, sometimes it can be a bully and it can start to direct or try to take over the attitudes or behaviors of the person that you think would be in control, that living person, that child, that adult. We call that independent agency. And you also see that in ghostly episodes. In fact, we did a follow-up study where if you look at those experiences that people talk about spooky childhood experiences, those ICs that are very shallow are almost always explained away as imagination. Certainly nothing paranormal. But when you look at those experiences that people talk about in paranormal terms, it almost always has that element of independent agency. This being, this character, was separate from the child, separate from the adult, and it was acting on its own, and it was trying to actually influence the behavior of the person having the experience. And that is where things get really interesting and really spooky. And if that isn't enough, you can congratulate me because we just had a new study published in a journal called Psychological Reports, a mainstream journal where we looked at the structure over time of these spooky imaginary friend experiences. And we found out that transliminality leads to higher creativity, which leads to ghostly experiences, which leads to other entity encounters. In other words, it doesn't just stop with the child being creative, but then they seem to what? Create a spooky childhood friend. That spooky childhood friend then decides to go on their own, have their own personality, their own behavior, but then the child experiences something beyond just a ghost experience. They'll start seeing things like elves, fairies. They'll start feeling other kinds of presences that go beyond just the one character. So we actually have some scientific evidence of the evolution of these things, and it kind of confirms our early hypothesis that some childhood companions are something more than just imagination. They take on elements that go into at least deep psychology, if not parapsychology. So sorry to monopolize, but it's so exciting.
Cindy, anything to add before I read this first one?
About the only thing I would like to add is there was some information in the follow-up study about personified objects, which children will take like a favorite, I don't know, stuffed animal or something and give it, personal characteristics. They give it a name and a personality, etc. And what I thought was interesting was that these can be used for focus objects, for possible psychokinesis that can, for lack of a better word, jump into the environment and be experienced by others. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating.
Well, and I'll add, because I want to make sure we get this first one read, but I'll also add that in those studies that we did, there were a sizable percentage of people where the parents witnessed some of the phenomena in addition to the children. So the idea that all of these cases were simply, purely internal to the individual or only experienced by the child that was having the imaginary friend, I want to say it was about 1 in 5 where psychokinesis, objects moving, things along those lines were noted or at least witnessed by the parents as well. So, there's definitely a factor of spooky in this, or simply not, like a really clear-cut answer. But that having said, let me put on my best childhood voice. Hello, Jim. This is my child.
He did exactly what I told him not to do.
I know exactly. I won't do it.
He's just a nonconformist.
I know. So
I think he has conduct disorder or something. This is go ahead, Brian, please.
Right, oh God, I got
go ahead and scare me.
You
actually have a shot, because ghost stories involving children are always more frightening than the ones involving adults.
Absolutely.
Right? So go ahead, try to scare me.
So all right, I'll start off at the beginning. I had a demonic imaginary friend. Well, more of an acquaintance. It never spoke to me. I spoke to it. It showed up in the corner of my room one day, and it stayed there for a whole year. The best way I can describe the thing is it had a spider-like body, 8 long pitch black arms and legs that were all spiky and gross. But the kicker is it had a human face. The thing that haunts me to this day is its smile. It never stopped smiling. The smile stretched from ear to ear with spiky teeth. I know the smile thing is a cliche, but even as a kid, I knew that nothing should have a mouth that wide. Its eyes were human-like, and it didn't have a nose, almost Voldemort style. Also, it was like it was wearing a poorly made black wig. I don't know why, but I never really questioned the thing in the corner of my room. I'll just call it Spider-Man of my nightmares because I'm tired of calling it the thing. As a kid, I knew it was normal to have imaginary friends because my friends told me they had one, and I was like, oh, cool, I'm not weird. This is normal. But then my friends told me their imaginary friends were unicorns or fairies or angels with shiny wings. That was the first thing that tipped me off that this thing might not be what I thought it was. I would sit on my bed and look at the corner that was always slightly darker than the other. Look in the corner that was always slightly darker than the other corners where Nightmare Spider-Man sat or perched, whatever spiders do when they're sitting. I would actually tell the spider guy my problems. Like a kid stole my favorite silly band, or I dropped my cookie at lunch and ants got on it. The spider dude never answered, never even moved except to sometimes shift its legs to a more comfortable position. At first, I wasn't uncomfortable with it. I just avoided the corner or tried to make friends with it. I don't know what I was doing. I'm just a very friendly person, and I thought it looked lonely. But every time I told a friend of mine that my imaginary friend was a creepy little arachnid dude, I would get strange stares, and I got more worried. I started noticing that at night, Spider Guy would stare at me, most likely thinking I was asleep. I eventually told my mother this, but she just looked at the corner and told me it just looked darker than usual. As the weeks turned into months, I got more spooked by the smiling spider, so much that I'd avoid ever going into my room except to sleep there. Now, here's the actual creepy part. Not that the rest of this wasn't unsettling, because it sure as heck was, right? Yeah, there you go. The days leading up to Spider-Man of my nightmare's disappearance, strange things started happening. This was around the year mark of our little guy living in my room. I would start getting nightmares of it leaving the corner and crawling underneath my bed, all over my body, on my ceiling, etc., etc. I would wake up to find that thing was still in its corner, thank goodness. But the nightmares progressively got worse, with the spider creep crawling all over my body with its nasty, pointy little legs. Oh, on my skin. The worst part was in the dreams. I couldn't move to escape it. I was stuck with its little spider legs touching me, and I would just wake up crying. I have a horrible fear of spiders now and their legs just because of the feeling in those dreams. And sometimes its smile would turn into a frown in my nightmare. And that was the part that made my blood run cold, because even in a dream, I was afraid I upset it. And with that, we have to take a break, and we'll be back to interpret that in just a couple of minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to Practical Parapsychology. Confession, that was actually me. I know this guy. I was in a black costume with a wig. I just sat in his room for a year just to see what would happen. So, there you go. Problem solved.
I suspected as much, actually. What's interesting about that account? First, it's really creepy, right? But on a number of levels. But it also introduces some of the problems of trying to do research. that's not just one experience. This person is recounting experiences over time. And in some ways, if I heard it correctly, the way the experience was maybe at the beginning is not always how it was at the end. There may have been some alterations in what was seen, how it was perceived, the size of whatever it was. So this is a case where if you were to code this, what are you coding? Are you coding the entire case? Or are you trying to code an individual experience? And you have to be careful about that because you don't want to mix apples with oranges. But it is interesting also because a skeptic like me that's not informed might say, wait a minute, this clearly is imagination because this person's story keeps changing. The entity that they saw at the beginning didn't match in the middle, and at the end, it seemed to change. The details don't match up. There's no reliable witness here. When actually we know when it comes to entity encounter experiences, whatever it is, that core phenomenon, it changes depending on the context of the person or even of the setting. We even know from haunt cases where someone could be seeing an apparition and it appears a certain way, but somebody right next to them sees something different, dressed differently. The details are different. So they might be part of the same core phenomenon, but the wrapping, the details, the theater around it can change. And if that can happen across people, I can imagine it happens with a person. So this is an interesting case because there's a lot of complexity and nuance here. And depending on what you're trying to achieve in research would depend on what exactly you're trying to code and how.
Yeah. Well, I might go down the rabbit hole further and say that, people that are trained to do visualization exercises or regularly engage in kind of like Jungian archetype work, you would actually pay attention to changes. And if you have developed an entity in your imagination that over time, right, looks a certain way, the entity changing its appearance over time usually, right, would represent some sort of symbol that you should interpret because in theory that would have meaning. So, I mean, you would even see that in esoteric and religious and meditation practices that the entity may change form over time, even when a person has trained themselves to make it look in their mind's eye a certain way. So,
interesting.
2 cents.
Although I don't know if we even need Jungian archetypes here because, again, maybe this is me being skeptical, okay? But as I heard that story and the changing of this spider figure, the person made it very clear, I think, where at least part of the source material came from. That doesn't dismiss or debunk the unusualness of the experience. But this person references Spider-Man, okay? And there is a foe to Spider-Man known as Venom. Yep. Which is black. It has a grin that goes ear to ear. It can open its mouth. It's part spider, part person. It's not friendly. It can be quite terrifying. And so, I mean, I was listening to that. I went immediately to Marvel movies. Like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
This sounds a lot like comic book kind of material in a character that maybe was then adapted, molded, modified. But I saw Venom, the character of Venom in that story. And then it got more spider-like as the series of experiences went on. But again, I'd love to interview this person, right, to get some clarification. But I'm curious what you two saw or heard in that account.
I didn't see Spider-Man like in the Marvel universe. I did catch Voldemort though. And, it didn't have, let's see here. Yeah, it didn't have a nose, almost Voldemort style. So that would lead me to believe that this person at least was familiar with Harry Potter, with fantasy. So, I mean, it's not too much of a stretch. I mean, I suppose I didn't get Venom from Spider-Man though. I actually thought more of a fantasy spider with a human face, kind of almost Alice in Wonderland type entity that was just sitting over in her corner or his corner. So, but I didn't get Spider-Man.
Well, but here's the interesting point. So what SSE items do we officially check off on this? And guys, the only one I caught was I saw folklore type being because there's not active communication. Unless, I was reading it, so I could have missed something, but you don't hear about objects moving or I think it even touching him. So he's just talking about, or she, did he say?
Well, there was a touch. This person described, remember the legs walking over him or her as they laid in bed. Did I not hear that?
I don't remember hearing about that. Or
I thought the person that talked about this thing crawling over it.
Well,
And,
it had
and this
dreams
person
about it.
could feel the legs.
Yeah.
I thought he had dreams about it, but he
Yes.
said it never communicated or touched him. So,
Okay,
you know,
in that case, then you're right. All that story, even though it happens over time, revolves around one anomaly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, again, the case in point. Don't need a lot to create a very fantastic, spooky narrative. When in fact we're dealing with one type of core phenomena, persistent, by the way, right, over a long period of time. But beyond that,
And that's an important point, though, right? I mean, having an experience of a apparition, a ghost, some kind of entity, you can even induce that experimentally in people, whether they're believers in the paranormal or not. But someone that has that experience naturally, when they're not wanting to have it, they're not looking to have it, and then it persists over time, that is a very different type of experience. In fact, it might be even one that relates to what we talk about in our book, Ghosted, where the people that recurrently have these kinds of experiences and that are interpreted as paranormal and involving paranormal entities that are following or even persecuting a person. We have a whole map of the psychology that might go along with that. So you could test hypotheses like we talk about in the book Ghosted using the SSE. So that's a good example.
Including, psychological distress from seeing a spider critter in your corner of your room for, so let me read case 2, guys, because we're running short here. So you ready? Here we go. Ready for case number 2 of imaginary friend creepiness?
Go for it.
Cindy, you don't look excited enough. Come on.
Yay!
All right, there you go. Yeah. All right, so here we go. When I was around 8 years old, I had what my parents called an imaginary friend, only she wasn't imaginary. Her name was Ellen Houran. Sorry, Ellen. She lived in our house long before I was born. She was a little girl around my age at the time. She was slight with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was incredibly sweet. We spent hours talking and playing. Suddenly, she said that she had something very serious she wanted to talk to me about one day. Back in the early 1800s is when she lived with her sister and her parents. Her father had gone crazy one night and shot her mom. He then came to the girls, first covering Ellen's sister's face with a pillow, then shooting her in the head using the pillow as a silencer. Wow. He came after Ellen. He did the same thing to Ellen that he had done to his sister. He soon after incinerated their bodies, leaving only ashes. He put their ashes into a box and placed that box behind a loose brick block in the wall. This is the story Ellen told me before leading me to the basement and pointing out the broken cinder block. I pulled the block out of the wall, and right where she said it was her and 2 other women's ashes in a faded box. She asked me to take the box to the woods behind my house and to find a peaceful spot to lay them to rest. I led her out to the woods, turned to my left, and walked down to the creek. I walked a short way from the creek and dropped to my knees. I dug a hole deep enough to cover the box so it wouldn't be disturbed by anything. Before burying the remains and saying goodbye to Ellen, I asked myself what happened to her father. She looked at me saddened and said he shot himself. I told her goodbye and that I hoped she found peace. I placed the box in the hole and covered it with soil. Ellen thanked me and gave me a hug saying goodbye and that she would be watching over me from heaven. I smiled and told her I would never forget her, obviously I haven't. So what do you think about that one, guys?
To me, I think we have a budding horror author here. I had a really tough time buying that this was an actual account. It just seemed full of horror movie tropes. It could be an actual account, but I was really, really dubious on this one.
Well, I can say that the using the pillow as a silencer thing works from experience.
Wow. Again, he says these things, and it's in perpetuity. You can never run for office again, Brian. This is a very different kind of childhood imaginary companion experience because it doesn't read like any of the other ones. Instead, this is almost like a contact experience that you see with mental mediumship of some sort, right?
Yeah.
It also plays on, as you're saying, Cindy, the traditional narrative of, the ghost that's tied to earth because of unfinished business.
Right.
Very Sixth Sense to this, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the details are very adult. I'd be very curious of, one, when did this supposedly happen? What age was the person when they had this imaginary companion experience? And then what age did they relay it? Because just the trappings of saying using a pillow as a silencer, that is a very particular word used in a very particular way that most children wouldn't use. unless you're into certain violent movies or video games, some of the imagery here and just the storyline reads as very adult. Yes. So I
Yeah.
would be very suspect. That doesn't mean that you dismiss, right? You'd want to investigate. That would be a hypothesis that you could test. But I would want a lot more details over the context of when this experience happened, when was it relayed and documented, and could I follow up and ask some questions? Because there's a lot.
Yeah. And in fact, I think I remember as I looked over this one, I purposefully coded it as possibly fan fiction, right? It's a great narrative. But I was like, maybe we should be suspicious of this one, right? Overtly so.
But there still is the point, though, that even spontaneous ghostly episodes where people aren't looking for something to happen, they don't necessarily want it to happen, that doesn't mean that that person is some independent, objective witness to events. I think if there's something that we've found in all of our research, it's that people that experience hauntings in whatever form they may take, they're not passive witnesses. Witness is the wrong word. They actually contribute to their experience.
Sure.
They contribute to when it happens. They contribute to the details of the experience. If not when it's happening, certainly in the recall of the experience. So people do participate in the construction of their experiences in real time and at recall. And that is still a good point, that there are no absolutely sanitized ghost experiences. There's always a little bit of the person in the experience.
Yep. So because we're getting close on time, Cindy, what did you get out of the SSE with that?
I coded it as a human apparition and communication with the dead. And those are the only two things I got out of the SSE.
Yep. So as we are running out of time, ladies and gentlemen, because we all three of us, whenever we're three of us are on, we talk all day long, right? We're like, no, give us 2 hours. But no, the take-home message, guys, from looking at these accounts, we did 4, we did 2 hauntings, and then we did 2 imaginary friend accounts. But notice that they're not chocked full of SSE items. Some of them can be, but again, kind of the key take-home is we have to separate the story from the core events. I think that for lay people, that's what's important. Pick out those actual, quote unquote, paranormal details, so to speak.
And usually there's a huge difference between what actually happened and people's telling of what happened. There's a huge gap there. And science is concerned with both, but it starts with understanding the core events.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, any last words, ladies and gentlemen?
I don't like the phrase last words. Sounds like something's going to happen to me after this broadcast ends.
You can take a pillow with a gun, and it'll work as a silencer.
As a silencer,
You know who I want to be a silencer. This is what you're doing, and this is what I want you to do. No, but we should also make sure that on our website, practicalparapsychology.com, that we give references specifically to the studies on the imaginary companions and the spooky elements they have. We encourage people to read more about it because it is a fascinating and it's a really underappreciated aspect of parapsychology.
Yep. No, I agree. And I'll try and get that up for right after this episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening to all of us, and Jim, thank you for coming on. Cindy, thanks for putting up with me as always.
Always.
And we will see you next week for more fun talking about the SSE on Practical Parapsychology.